Divisions around the United Nations Security Council table are clearly showing their face. The UNSC voting on two resolutions Friday. The first, drafted by Kuwait, was to ensure international protection for Palestinian civilians in Gaza and the West Bank. 10 countries, including Russia and France, voted in favour of the resolution. 4 others, Britain, Poland, the Netherlands and Ethiopia, abstained. Here's what the US and Israeli envoys had to say.
The resolution offered by Kuwait represents a grossly one-sided view of what has taken place in Gaza in recent weeks. Anyone who cares about the peace process should vote against it. The terrorist group Hamas bears primary responsibility for the awful living conditions in Gaza.
This was a resolution born in sin. It tried to continue an alarming trend, absolving Hamas of all responsibility for the violence and death it has caused. The resolution mentions Israel 5 times. I don't know who drafted it. Many were active. 5 times you mention Israel. Yet, you couldn't bring it yourself to mention Hamas even once. Don't you know how to spell it? It empowers Hamas by granting it the Security Council's stamp of approval.
Then, in a somewhat humiliating turn for the United States, it was the only country to back its own resolution condemning Hamas for the recent violence. Its resolution demanded that Hamas and other Palestinian groups cease, quote, all violent, provocative actions in Gaza. The US was the only country to vote in favour of its revised draft resolution. 11 countries abstained and 3 rejected the proposal. Let's hear the UK and Palestinian perspective on that.
We condemn Hamas, but at the same time, we regret that the American text does not adequately reference Israel's responsibilities and obligations with regard to Gaza. Therefore, Mr. President, the United Kingdom will abstain on both resolutions today.
This is the reality of the constant aggression, threats, and existential crisis the Palestinian people are enduring under Israeli occupation, which the current U.S. administration regrettably refuses to see, refuses to get it, or in any way fairly and properly address.
All right, let's turn to our panel for insight. Bianca, kick us off. How unprecedented is this that the United States was left alone, the only one to back its own draft resolution?
Well, look, Tracy, I think the question is here, what were they expecting when they proposed this? It was a very one-sided proposal, very one-sided draft, and that's why I think it was more about sending a message, because they knew they weren't going to get the full support on this. This was very clear. And I think it was more about really sending a message and answer to the other draft resolution. And also, it really shows that these votes are largely symbolic, right? It shows the division, it shows how paralyzed the Security Council is right now. So they're enforcing the 2 different narratives that are being pulled apart, and the U.S. wants to make sure that their narrative is kept.
But Mike, perhaps not the full support, but no support?
You know, you can look at this 2 ways. You can look at it as the United States really didn't try to whip up a vote, really didn't make the effort. You can also look at it as the U.S. just not caring and saying, listen, we're going to side with Israel even if the whole world is against us or doesn't really take a point of view one way or another. In the end, Bianca says the UN Security Council is paralyzed. It's a waste of time. Nothing comes out of the Security Council, and even when they vote on something and can agree on something, nothing ever moves forward with the resolution. A huge, huge waste of time.
Mohammad, I want to get your perspective on this. Do you believe that the United States blindly supports Israel?
I don't believe it. I think it's the reality on the ground, and I think that Ambassador Nikki Haley is out of touch when she blames Hamas entirely for being behind the misery that the Palestinians in Gaza are living in. I don't know if she understands that there is an 11-year-old blockade being imposed by Israel on Gaza, that Egypt is also assisting the Israelis on imposing its own version of a blockade on Gaza, and also the Palestinian Authority has imposed its own sanctions on Gaza. What world is she coming from, and what does she read to understand what's happening on Gaza? And what happened the other night, Friday night, at the United Nations Security Council in New York, that highlights how isolated the United States have become, where it puts forth a draft resolution that not even its closest allies allies, Britain and France, votes for it. That is so insulting. Sure. That is so insulting to the U.S., and it highlights how alone and how isolated the U.S. has become since President Trump took office.
So, Mike, then, as Bianca suggested that these votes are largely symbolic, why take that tack if they're going to end up completely alone and isolate themselves?
I think they're just concerned more, especially Nikki Haley, who she could move to Israel and become prime minister here. The United States is more concerned with showing that they stand with Israel, and really they stand with Israel at all costs. They don't care. They don't care in the end if they don't get other votes.
I mean, at all costs, even at the cost of killing Palestinians in Gaza, even at the cost of not alleviating the humanitarian and economic situation in Gaza, rather than, this is a platform, an international platform that we're talking about. This is where you have the international community all put together. These people, I covered the UN for 5 years. These people, after the TV screens are turned off, these people actually mingle. Even the ones that don't necessarily have official relationships among each other, they talk to each other. And this is an opportunity for the U.S. to maybe reconnect with the Palestinians, maybe to show that, you know what, yes, we recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and yes, we moved the embassy, but we are still worried about the humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. And for the chief, diplomat for the U.S. internationally to come out and say that Hamas is behind the misery in Gaza, it's rather, you know what, it's sad. It's a sad level of where the U.S. international politics have come to.
But you mentioned the blockades, the Egyptian blockade, the Israeli blockade, and the fact that the Palestinian Authority is withholding salaries and cutting electricity.
This only happened in recent months,
I understand
by the way.
that,
it's not 11 years old.
It's not. I understand that, but others would point out there's a reason for those things happening that don't operate in a vacuum. They just didn't decide one day that we're going to impose these sanctions.
There is a difference between having a blockade to prevent weapons from reaching Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, and from flour and cement and clean water and goods for the people of Gaza to achieve medical aids. I mean, what does Israel benefit from not having medical aid get into the Gaza Strip? What does Israel and the Palestinian Authority and Egypt benefit? And by the way, I guarantee you that Egypt's blockade, which is a mini blockade compared to Israel, is only there because Israel wants it to be there, not because Egypt wants it to be there. Egypt and Hamas now have relatively good relationship, but Egypt cannot go on its own and have its own blockade imposed.
Look, I just want to add something here, because we're talking about how behind the scenes at the UN they're still mingled, but at the UN Security Council, this is not where the solutions are going to be made, right? And there's this famous quote that the UN is not created to take the humanity to heaven, but to keep it from going into hell. But the situation that we're seeing in Gaza right now is...
We have examples of international crises that have been somewhat resolved and taken care of at the United States.
Right now. It's become a place to send out your message.
Well, no message has been sent other than to the Palestinian people. They don't care.
It does seem that we can almost expect what kind of a result we see at the United Nations. It does seem to be that it's about a message, and perhaps that's some kind of strategy. Stick to your story and hope for the best, I suppose, because they're not really finding any resolutions here.